Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Jessica Murray, Director of Alumni Relations at the Maxwell School. I'm joined by two of my wonderful Maxwell colleagues today, Jessica Smith, Director of Communications and Media Relations, and Lane Norton, Assistant Dean for Advancement. Together, we're delighted to welcome the forum. Today's event is the latest in a series of conversations with Maxwell faculty members who are leading experts nationally and internationally on important topics of the day. Today, we're delighted to have James Steinberg, University Professor of Social Science, International Affairs, and Law at Syracuse University, join us. Professor Steinberg served as Dean of the Maxwell School from July 2011 until June 2016. Prior to becoming Dean, he served as Deputy Secretary of State, the Principal Deputy Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton from 2009 to 2011. From 2005 to 2008, Steinberg was Dean of the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. From 2001 to 2005, Mr. Steinberg was Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution. Mr. Steinberg was Deputy National Secretary Advisor to President Clinton from 1996 to 2000. During that period, he also served as the President's personal representative to the 1998 and 1999 G8 summits. Prior to becoming Deputy National Security Advisor, Mr. Steinberg held positions as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Staff and as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Analysis in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He is the recipient of the Joseph J. Krusel Memorial Award, American Political Science Association 2014, the CIA Director's Medal in 2011, and the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award in 2011. Steinberg's most recent books are A Glass Half Full, Rebalance, Reassurance, and Resolve, and Strategic Reassurance, and Resolve, U.S.-China Relations in the 21st Century, both with Michael Hanlon. Recent book chapters include President for New Creation, the role of the State Department in formulating and implementing U.S. global policy, United States grappling with rising powers, and history policymaking in the Balkans, lessons imported and lessons learned. He has also authored Difficult Transitions, Foreign Policy Troubles at the Outset of Presidential Power with Kurt Campbell. Mr. Steinberg received his AB from Harvard College and a JD from Yale Law School. He is married to Sherburne Abbott, University Professor at Syracuse University, and they have two children, Jenna and Emma Steinberg. On to you, Professor Steinberg. Would you like to open up our session?
Well, thanks so much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you all. Thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. I see a number of colleagues and former colleagues and students on the list of people participating, which is really great, and look forward to your comments and questions. I hope you're all doing well and doing safe at these difficult times. I want to talk briefly to you today about China and China's response to the COVID outbreak, both to talk a little bit about what it means for our understanding about what's going on in China today in terms of its leadership, its political strategy, both domestic and international, and then end with a few observations about the implications for U.S.-China relations. I think it's pretty obvious to all of us it's becoming an increasingly important issue, particularly as we move in to our election season. But I want to leave plenty of time for comments, so I'm going to make just a few broad remarks to begin with and then open to anything you'd like to focus on. I want to begin by talking a little bit about the context of this and particularly how to think about China's response to the COVID outbreak over the past several months in light of the earlier experience that China had with the SARS outbreak, because there are lots of important similarities and a few differences between what happened back now almost 20 years ago during the SARS outbreak and the response we've seen in the past few months by the current leadership of China. And I think my colleagues have shared with you a very important and interesting article detailing in quite a lot of valuable specificity about that SARS outbreak. So if that's of interest to you, I commend it to you. It's pretty well known at the time that the initial response back in 2002 to the SARS outbreak by China was seriously inadequate and raised a number of problems about the way the Chinese system worked dealing with crises of this kind, and particularly about the strengths and weaknesses of the way in which the Communist Party exercises control within China. And the fundamental lessons that came out of that experience was the difficulty in a situation, despite the nominal degree of control that the leadership has at the top, and the sort of the notion that the Communist Party, and particularly the Politburo Standing Committee, this small group of leaders, have absolute control over China, but also the realities of governing in a very large country, where as a practical matter, power and decisions are very decentralized, and there are very serious problems about communicating from higher to lower levels about crises. It's both a bureaucratic problem about the difficulties of getting information up through complex chains of command, but also problems with the system itself, as lower level officials are torn between, on the one hand, not wanting to present bad news to the leadership for fear that it will reflect badly on them. On the other hand, pressed by the concern that they may be held responsible for things going badly. And we saw in the SARS response that the Chinese leadership was very slow to respond, that local leaders were very reluctant to pass up the chain, the bad news information to the leadership, and the leaders who were relatively new under President Hu had their eyes focused on other issues and were very slow to come to grips with the crisis. And so the response at the time was slow and halting. A lot of information was withheld from the center. But ultimately, as the leadership began to realize the magnitude of the SARS crisis, the power of the Communist Party kicked into action, began to undertake some heroic measures to deal with both treating those who were already sick and containing the outbreak of the crisis. After the very poor and fitful start of the Chinese leadership, began to get a hold of the situation, and it was brought under control. Many people thought at the time that the experience with SARS and the sort of near miss of a catastrophe from the SARS outbreak would have a big impact on China, on Chinese leadership, and that powerful lessons might be learned in terms of how to deal with future crises of the sort. I don't think anybody thought at the time or subsequently that SARS was a unique problem that represented a one-off challenge that would never be seen again. And so as we look at the response today by China to the COVID outbreak beginning in December 2019, one is struck by how many of the problems that were seen at the time of the SARS outbreak were replicated again here in the current crisis, notwithstanding what one would have thought all the lessons that should have been learned from the SARS crisis. We see the same problems of the difficulty of passing information to higher levels, the unwillingness of lower level officials to present bad news to the leadership, the difficulty of the leadership in terms of organizing itself to respond to the crisis, and the tendency, rather than to quickly embrace the bad news information and try to deal with it quickly, a tendency to blame the purveyors of the bad news, in this case, many of the medical professionals who began to warn of the dangers of the COVID outbreak. And as we saw tragically in the case of COVID, actually shaming and even imprisoning some of the whistleblowers and the Cassandras who called out the bad news on social media. And so we saw a pattern that was a very similar replication to what happened in the early stages of SARS take place once again as COVID broke out. Slow response, failure to pass information up the chain, failure to establish clear lines of authority, and a central leadership that either was unwilling or unable to take early control of the outbreak. And similar to the SARS crisis, we saw the leadership finally realizing the magnitude of the problem, and once they did, kicking in with the power of the state in terms of its ability to impose draconian measures on movement of people, to dramatically invest in quickly building facilities both to treat those infected and to quarantine those who might be exposed and the like. And similarly with the SARS epidemic, after a very, very poor and difficult start, we saw what amounts to really quite an amazing level of achievement in China. The fact that with the measures, the lockdown and the like, that despite the magnitude of the human tragedy in Wuhan and Hubei, really quite remarkably, the ability to control the spread and prevent it from reaching the other major population centers of China. And so we see, this sort of two sides of the coin story here. On the one hand, the terrible tragedy and loss of life and disruption in Wuhan and Hubei, and on the other hand, the really remarkable ability to prevent this from becoming a pan-China epidemic that affected all 1.4 billion Chinese. And so it tells us, I think, importantly, how much the response to this crisis really shows, again, the strengths and weaknesses and some of the endemic features of the Chinese system. The fact that the leadership has enormous power, and when it brings it to bear, can achieve really quite remarkable things. That the system itself is one in which the fears of the consequences of spreading bad news, the difficulties of managing a very large country, and the problem of both decentralizing power and yet having accountability, all combine to make the ability and the resiliency of the system to respond quickly to these kinds of outbreaks with transparency, with honesty, and with candor, a very, very difficult one. And the fact that, in effect, no lessons were learned from SARS tells you a lot about the fundamental limits of the system itself. I think the big difference now that we've seen is not so much in the pattern of the initial response and then the subsequent reaction, but now how the Chinese leadership is trying to use this crisis. In the case of SARS, there's no doubt that the initial outbreak of the disease and the failure to respond immediately to the disease posed a real challenge to the then leadership of China, especially President Hu Jintao. But the fact that they were able to get it under control was something that the leadership was able to point to as a success of the system. But because the power was more distributed and it was more of a collective leadership in those days, this was less about the power of one individual and more about the power of the party itself and the party system. But as I think you all know, since the days of Hu Jintao and the idea of collective leadership, under President Xi, the power has become much more personalized, and both the successes and the failures of the system are much more owned by one individual rather than the party itself. And so what we've seen in recent weeks is not simply an attempt by the Communist Party leadership to turn this away from a narrative of early failures by the Communist Party and focus on the subsequent successes, but even more to focus on the personal achievements of President Xi and the success of the kinds of centralized leadership that he has instituted as a model, not just for China, but for the rest of the world. And so after the SARS outbreak, we didn't see Hu Jintao and his team essentially going around the world trying to tout the effectiveness of the Chinese response or to use this as an argument in the international arena for why the Chinese system was so effective in dealing with these kinds of crises. But today, as China is playing a much more active role on the global stage, and there's much more focus on the competition with the United States and the US model versus the Chinese model, we see the Chinese leadership now trying to turn this initial disaster into a success story for China, not just in terms of its domestic success and proving to the domestic audience that the Communist Party is deserving of the support of the Chinese people, but now taking its case to the global community and trying to demonstrate that China has a model that can effectively deal with these crises, and it's a model that other countries should emulate. And we see this in the very elaborate public diplomacy campaign that the Chinese leadership is now conducting, both in terms of touting its success in containing the contagion, but also in this effort to try to show that China now is not only helping to solve the problem at home, but helping other countries abroad by providing medical supplies, by providing expertise and financial assistance to countries around the world, from Southeast Asia to the Middle East, to Africa, to Latin America, and to Europe. And we see this very elaborate campaign to paint the Chinese as the provider of global public goods and global public leadership in dealing with the corona crisis. But even there, we see some of the limitations of the Chinese system, because even as China is trying to promote itself as a system which can deal with the problems at home and provide a model for others, the ability of the Chinese leadership to convey that message in a convincing way has been, I think, quite ineffective. That the Chinese have very limited expertise or experience in terms of how to speak to a global audience. And the kinds of messages that it uses and the kind of techniques and propaganda that it uses for its own citizens play very poorly on the global international stage. And so we see, notwithstanding the fact that many countries are grateful for Chinese financial support and medical support and technical support, the rather heavy-handed way in which China has been promoting its position and its role, I think, is beginning to generate a backlash around the world as countries are beginning to question whether China is really doing this out of charitable and public spiritedness, or whether China has ulterior motives as to why promoting its support and its model as a way to deal with this. And so whether this turns out, the response turns out to be a success for China and for the Communist Party, both domestically and internationally, remains to be seen. I think the Chinese leadership is feeling much more self-confident these days about the story. I think in the early going, there was a lot of anxiety in Beijing about how this would affect China, both domestically and internationally. But we see a kind of growing confidence and assertiveness on both the domestic stage and the international stage. But whether that's warranted, I think, is less clear than perhaps the Chinese leadership itself desires. But one of the consequences of this new, more assertive strategy China is pursuing, I think, is to deepen what were already very deep tensions between the United States and China. There were, even absent this more proactive public diplomacy campaign of China, there were many people in the United States who, particularly in light of the difficulties of our own response to COVID, were more than open to the idea of looking for someone else to blame for the disease. And the efforts of the Chinese subsequently to promote their effectiveness of their response and their global good stewardship, I think, has just stoked the fires here in the United States of those who want to push back against this happy story that China wants to tell in terms of rebutting and undercutting Chinese arguments. And this, I think, as I say, is stoking tensions in what was already a very fraught relationship between the United States and China. And we've seen, even in the past couple of days, a very tense back and forth between the Trump administration and Chinese officials, including a televised interview just in the last 24 hours with the Chinese vice foreign minister, and a rather contentious pushback against some of the challenges and claims by the U.S., not just from the Trump administration, but by members of Congress and others who are challenging China's role in the COVID virus. And so this, I think, portends a very, very difficult additional burden on Sino-U.S. relationships at a time when we're going into a presidential campaign. And as Jessica mentioned, a number of years ago, Kurt Campbell and I wrote a book about the role of foreign policy in campaigns and political transitions. And we wrote quite a bit about how China and U.S.-China relations has been one of the most contentious issues for a long period of time, really going back to the election of 1980 under Ronald Reagan. And I think we can anticipate quite a lot of focus in this coming election about the future of U.S.-China relations and the appropriate strategy for the United States towards China. And with COVID coming on top of disputes like the Huawei cyber issues around trade and the like, as I say, I think we're going to see a very contentious debate about how the United States and China should develop their relationship in the coming months. So let me stop there, and happy to take any and all of your questions or comments.
The
Jess, I
questions
believe.
are already. Yep, I unmiked. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Steinberg. As you said, we'd love to move to some questions now. We had some questions queue up in the chat session before we started. And so our first question will be from Acuite. And his question is, I've seen articles projecting that China will be the largest economy in 15 to 20 years. Do you think COVID-19 is a catalyst to allow that to happen earlier? Second part, would you say every developing country must formulate a China strategy now?
So the question of China's economic trajectory is a very challenging one because so much of what we anticipate about the future of the Chinese economy is based on projecting where China is today and sort of projecting linearly out to where it might be in the future. And it's quite possible China will continue to grow. It's growing at a slower rate than it was during its earlier takeoff period. It's gone down from 10 to 12% growth to 5 or 6% growth even before the COVID outbreak. And certainly COVID has had a huge impact on the Chinese economy as it has elsewhere. Whether COVID represents a dramatic change in the direction of the global economy is a very big question, and one in which I don't have any special expertise. It's one in which many of the world's economists are now debating. But I think there's a deeper question about China's economic future, which has to do with the ability of China to make the transition from being an economy which was heavily dependent on a low-cost labor, manufacturing, assembly, and the like, to a high-tech, service-oriented economy with adequate domestic demand to support its economy. China's got a lot of resources. It's technologically very capable. It's got a pretty well-educated workforce. And so it is possible that China will make that transition. But there are also some questions about whether it can do that without opening up and reforming its political system. So China, even before COVID, was at an economic crossroads, slower growth, more challenges in terms of how to retool its economy, to focus on higher skilled work, how to move away from export-led growth to more domestic demand, how to liberalize its markets to make it more competitive, how to rely less on state-owned enterprises. So I think we have to have a question mark about the medium-term future about Chinese economic growth. And that's just in absolute terms. And in relative terms, of course, how will we do? And will we make the adjustments and the changes that we need to make? I think the important thing to recognize is that even though China's absolute size of its economy is very large, and depending on what measures you use, might overtake the United States, in terms of per capita GDP, it's still way behind the United States. It is still a country with a lot of very poor people, a lot of people living on $2 a day less. And so you can't just look at the overall size of the GDP. You have to look more broadly at the economy as a whole, as the overall level of development of the country, to really assess where it is. And in that measure, China still has a fair way to go and a lot of challenges to face to develop an economy which is the equal of the United States.
We had a couple of questions come in asking about the possibility or whether this was COVID-19 in the realm of being a biological weapon or biological warfare.
So, as I said at the outset, I have no special knowledge. I know what you read in the papers and the like. And one of the things I've tried very hard to do as now one of your professors is to stay out of the classified world, which gives me greater freedom to talk about things without having to worry about my commitments to confidentiality. I would say that from what I have read from reliable sources, including from what the intelligence community and others have said publicly, that there's little evidence to support the idea that this have anything to do with biological weapons. I think there is a question about whether there could have been some association with a research laboratory in Wuhan. It's speculation. But the exact provenance of this, that is, whether it came from one of the animal markets in Wuhan or whether it came as a result of accidental contamination from a research laboratory, is something that we still need to learn more about. And I think it's important to try to understand and know what that was. We need to understand how these viruses get into the broader public, how they move, if they did, from animals to humans. And these are important questions, not simply as a matter of accountability, although accountability is quite important, but also so that we can understand and make sure that we have precautions in place to try to prevent this from happening in the future.
We have a few people who have raised their hands to ask a question using their microphone. So first, I think George Schaefer has a question.
Hey, George, how are you?
We just have to quickly unmic him.
Good, Jim. You've been fishing? Anyway, two questions, Jim. One, do we have any confidence that we're actually hearing the truth from the Chinese? Everything you've talked about is predicated upon openness. And, you know, we have a question about that. And then second, with Kim very ill apparently in North Korea, any actions that might be anticipated by the Chinese with regard to the power change there?
So let me start with the second question, George. So we don't know if Kim is ill or if Kim is on vacation or what's going on there. And you know, the one thing I learned after dealing with the North Korean problem for many, many years is that the safest thing is to assume that we don't really know what's going on. Clearly, he hasn't appeared in public. The South Korean government seems pretty relaxed about this thing, but that doesn't mean that that's true either. I think the important thing about this question is whether or not he's ill now or incapacitated or something's going on, we need to be prepared for contingencies here. We need to have thought through what might happen and how we would deal with it. And I think in thinking about that, and I think it's the important and very good part of your question, is we need to have conversations with all the other key actors to be ready for this so that people aren't surprised if and when contingencies like an unanticipated illness or some kind of succession crisis takes place in North Korea. And the most important conversation we need to have, second to the conversation we have with our allies in South Korea, is with China, and to have some understanding about how each side would understand and react to these kinds of crises. It's a difficult conversation. The Chinese are very reluctant to engage in those kinds of conversations, but the risk of having a crisis without some degree of understanding, coordination, and open channels of communication is very, very serious. And so we need to do our planning. We need to do our planning with our allies, and we need to have enough channels for the Chinese to be able to think carefully about the kinds of challenges and risks that a succession crisis might pose. Second, on what we know, what we don't know, what the truth is, what the truth isn't. We don't have all the facts. There's no question that there's a lot we do know. There's a lot the Chinese have shared, and there's a lot that they don't share. I think it is safe to say, George, that it is true that the virus has not spread widely through China. The Chinese government has a lot of control over information, but there's also a tremendous ability of the Chinese to communicate both among themselves and with others. And if there were widespread outbreaks in and Shanghai and Beijing, we would know about it, even if the Chinese government didn't want to share it with us. So in terms of the overall success in the Chinese to contain this, I think our evidence is pretty good. Are there still cases in Wuhan? Maybe, maybe not. I don't think we will ever have the full facts there. And you know, I do think that the issue of transparency is really quite an important one. But I think that we need to, work very hard on making clear what the consequences are of the lack of transparency. There have been some aspects that the Chinese have done a very good job, for example, in sharing information about the genome of the COVID. There are other areas where their cooperation has been very, very poor. And it has to be more than just the United States that's making clear the importance of the Chinese sharing with us and others what they know and what in fact is going on.
We also have a question from Zachary Wiggins. Zachary, would you like to unmute your microphone?
Thank you. Hi, Professor. My question is about Taiwan and the relationship between the U.S., Taiwan, and China. As we know, the U.S.'s relationship with Taiwan has been growing more friendly, whereas China's relationship with Taiwan has plummeted since the election of President Tsai Ing-wen in 2016 and her landslide re-election in 2020. And Taiwan has not been included in the World Health Organization since 2016 as well. My question is, do you think COVID-19 will affect the trajectory of the relationships between the three nations of the US, China, and Taiwan? And how do you think that will happen, especially since we have seen criticism of how China has dealt with COVID-19, and then we've seen praise of how Taiwan has handled COVID-19. And I was actually in Taiwan at the beginning of COVID-19 starting and saw the response up front, and it was very coordinated and very transparent. So I just want to know what your thoughts on how the relationship will go from here will be.
Great, Zachary, great question. Good to hear from you. So I think first, I just want to underscore your important point, which is how well the Taiwanese government and Taiwanese society responded to this crisis. And one of the things that's important about that, and I think it's implicit in your observations, but I want to make it explicit, which is that it proves you don't have to have an authoritarian government to have a successful response to a pandemic. And I think both the successes we've seen in South Korea and the successes in Taiwan prove that democratic governments are perfectly capable of mounting an effective communal response to a crisis of this sort. And I do think that ought to be a message to the rest of the world, both of the value of having Taiwan participating in organizations like the World Health Organization and being accepted as a legitimate member of the international community. Putting aside the question of whether it's going to be recognized as a state or not, there are ways to get around that, just as we have in the WTO, where we admitted Taiwan as an economy rather than as a country. But having said that, and you have made the powerful case as to why I think countries should be appreciative and see the value of having Taiwan being included and involved. Do I think it's going to make a difference? I regret to say no, because I think that regrettably, China continues to try to use coercive measures to deny Taiwan open space and to try to limit its role in the international community. And I see no evidence that the Chinese leadership are going to respond, more openly to this as a result of COVID. COVID ought to reinforce the need for us to put aside these political contentions in the name of the overall greater public good in dealing with global public health. But I don't see the Chinese leadership showing any evidence of that in response to this crisis.
Thank you very much.
I just clicked off the question I had queued up. We have a question that's come in from Kelly. She says, "Aloha, Professor Steinberg. I am an incoming MPA IR student. I was part of the Peace Corps China volunteer group evacuated out of the country due to COVID-19. Her program of 25 plus years was also unexpectedly permanently shut down this year. What do you think the role NGOs and non-obvious diplomatic organizations such as the Peace Corps will be in the coming years between the two countries?"
So, I think that I've always believed that the United States has many great strengths on the international stage, but the greatest strength we have is our people. And the Peace Corps is really the epitome of what we are best at and when we are at our best. And so thank you for that service, and we look forward to you being part of the community. I look forward to seeing you soon. We'll all be back soon. I think that we have to remember this, that it's always hard to put a precise, figure on how much these kinds of soft power efforts, how much difference does it make in the face of, broader military power and economic clout and the like. But I'm convinced that in the long run, part of the reason the United States has been so successful is because other countries have seen the United States as a country that cares not just about its own citizens, but about others, and sees that our own success depends on the success of other people as well. It's good for us, it's good for others, and we do well by doing good. And I think we need to continue to focus on that. I mean, one of the things, if you think about other crises, I talked a little bit about SARS before, but if you think about the US response to Ebola, I mean, it was an enormous success for the United States. Not only did we help the countries of West Africa contain the spread of this hugely dangerous disease, but we demonstrated the fact that we did have a concern and we're willing to put ourselves out and to employ our resources, our technology, even our wonderful men and women from the military to help deal with that crisis. And so as we see China going out and playing the soft power game and the so-called mask diplomacy and the like, we need to be in this game too. And we need to see that, you know, if we only worry about ourselves, we're going to be very isolated, and we're not going to find that there are a lot of people who are going to be working with us when we need to the extent that we are in a competition with China. So this is an opportunity for the United States to remember what we're good at and what we are when we're at our best. And I hope we'll get back to that quickly. I think it's profoundly in our interest, and it's not primarily the government, it is our people that really makes the biggest difference in making that happen. We've seen time and time again that what foreigners admire are not our government per se, it's our way of life, it's our people, it's our spirit, and we need to be out there reinforcing that message.
We have a message coming, or we have a question coming in through the microphone from Rich Wilhelm. Rich, go ahead and unmic if you'd like, or unmute rather.
Hey, Jim, nice to see you again. You may not want to go here, but you've been very clear about the strengths and weaknesses of the Chinese international effort in the aftermath of COVID-19. How would you evaluate the overall approach by the Trump administration across a range of things, military, trade, and now COVID-19 and the blame gaming that's going on there? I mean, can you give a brief analysis of that?
Well, Rich, thanks for the question. It's a big question and a complex one. I think that, you know, we're in the middle of a big debate now that goes beyond just the Trump administration about how to think about it and how to deal with China. I think, you know, just specifically in terms of the Trump administration, it's very hard to know what the Trump administration's overall strategy is. On the one hand, you have the sort of formal documents of the Trump administration, like their National Security Strategy Report, that basically has defined the relationship as a geostrategic competition between the United States and China across the full range of issues. But it's not clear whether President Trump fully buys into that. Many times it appears that he has much more of a transactional view, working to get a better deal for the United States on trade, getting more support on issues like North Korea, and is willing to take each issue one by one to see what best deal he can get, and also to work with China when he wants to. We've seen he's very often been praising China and praising President Xi. So there's a little bit of uncertainty about just how much the sort of the formal strategy of the administration corresponds to the strategy that the president himself has in mind. But I want to talk to your broader question, because I do think that beyond President Trump, there is a question about how do we orient ourselves to China, and are we in the early stages of a new Cold War in which we are competing with China across the globe in every domain for power and influence, in which it's a zero-sum contest in which one or the other side wins and the other will lose, and to the finish. I think, you know, it's possible that we will go in that direction and end up in that place, but I think a lot of it depends on choices that both our country and China makes. In the first instance, and I've written this in the 2 books that Jessica talked about at the beginning, there's a critical responsibility on the part of China to really demonstrate what its long-term intentions are. As the rising power are understandably in a better position to advance their interests, to provide for their own security, but the very fact of doing that can be threatening to others and raise questions about whether China wants to advance its interests at the expense of others. So in the first instance, the burden is really on China's leadership to demonstrate that while it wants a greater voice in the international community, it wants to have greater security that comes from having a stronger economy and a more powerful military, that it's not going to use it in ways that are harmful to others, and that it wants to grow and thrive with others, not against them. And we should be ready to reciprocate that if China is willing to go in that direction. But at the same time, make clear that if China is not prepared to do that, and if it wants to try to throw its weight around and try to get its way at the expense of others, that the United States will work with its allies and respond to that. So we're at a watershed moment. I think both sides are easily slipping into the idea that conflict is inevitable. It may be, but I think we need to do everything we can before we get to that point to explore the possibility of a greater path in a different direction. And COVID is a real important reminder about why that's necessary. Because, you know, if we don't cooperate on things like pandemic disease and sustaining the global economy, we can all try to solve these problems by ourselves, but it'll be much more costly, much more difficult, and much less successful.
We have a question that came in the chat area from Maria, who is asking your thoughts on China's trial of state-run digital currency and decision to cancel the dollar peg in stock exchange transactions.
Well, I don't think China has a dollar peg. The caller will have to explain to me what specifically is in mind there. I mean, there are a lot of ways in which China is trying to increase the use of the RMB as a currency in international transactions. That may be what the questioner is talking about. And I do think that China is interested in raising the status of the renminbi as a reserve currency and as a form of settling international transactions so as to be less dependent on the dollar and to have a greater say in the international financial community. But whether China will be successful in doing that, I think depends a lot on whether China is prepared to have the openness and transparency about the way it manages its currency, it manages reserves, its financial regulation and the like, and including the convertibility of the renminbi in order for it to be successfully accepted. And I think that the limited success they've had up till now really does reflect that. I think that China has to face a number of critical decisions on the global economy because it's still torn between a managed economy with a profound role for the state, not just in managing the currency, but managing financial regulation, market transactions, the role of the state-owned enterprises and the like, and really becoming open and transparent to the markets. So I think we'll have to wait and see which direction China wants to go and whether it's willing to subject itself to the kind of transparency that's needed. We've seen just in the last few days a great controversy about the role of Chinese firms on the U.S. stock market and whether there's been adequate transparency to justify the listing of Chinese firms on the New York Stock Exchange, on NASDAQ, and the like. And so there's a long way to go before I think the renminbi and the Chinese financial system will be accepted as a global gold standard.
Alexandra has her hand raised. Alexandra has her hand raised and like to ask a question using her microphone.
Hi,
Unmuting.
Steinberg. I was a MBA IR student who graduated in 2015. So thank you for being on. It's good to see you. My question is about how COVID-19 might affect China's climate ambitions and its ability to meet its climate goals and subsequently the globe's ability to meet the goals set out at Paris. So China's economy, as we know and you discussed earlier, has been growing at a breakneck speed, and part of that has been on its use of coal. And in recent years, we've seen China try to reduce its carbon emissions, but as its economy has contracted and slowed, it's turned to approving more coal plants and using coal. Now with the onset of COVID-19 and the economy coming to a screeching halt, do you think the Chinese government is going to turn to a no holds barred approach to getting the economy started again, and how do you think that will affect China's climate goals, or will they be able to balance this economic growth with reductions in carbon in the future?
Great question, Alexandra, and I think it's a question that applies not just to China, but more whether this crisis will have any impact on the problem of climate warming emissions more broadly. I mean, there's no doubt in the short term that we're seeing a dramatic decline in emissions. But as always happens in international relations, and I know you know this well, no good deed goes unpunished, and every coin has a flip side. And one of the flip sides here, of course, is we're seeing, unprecedented in recent memory low prices for fossil fuels. And so we have this sort of irony, which on the one hand, the shutdowns of the economy has reduced emissions. On the other hand, it's made oil and gas much cheaper. And as countries start to think about restarting their economies and trying to sustain economic growth, there will be a temptation to go to the cheapest sources. And although there's been considerable progress in improving the efficiency and affordability of renewables and the like, there's no doubt that it's just the lower prices for fossil fuels will make it harder for renewables and other sources of energy to compete. And so we're going to see a tension, I think, as countries begin to focus on economic recovery about what's the fastest way to get people back to work, to get economies going again, and especially at low fuel price costs, the temptation to go back to fossil fuels, I think, will be quite high, even though that may be a very short-sighted response, and there ought to be a moment here in which people step back and see this as an opportunity to tackle this generational challenge that we face now to deal with climate change and global warming. It's not clear to me that the overall effect of this crisis will be either for China or for anybody else to significantly affect the calculations they're making about the trade-offs between economic growth and protecting the climate.
We have a question that came in from Terry through the chat window. Global health pandemics demand international cooperation for obvious reasons. Do you see prospects for the US and China to work together on health issues in the current environment of blame and distrust? What about private sector and university initiatives?
So, as you said, Terry, I mean, you would think it would be self-evident that if anything reminded us of our interconnectedness and the need for cooperation, it is pandemic disease. And that no country can do this. It's, you could try to build walls around a country, but it's very difficult, and the consequences of trying to do that are very, very serious indeed. And even if we could do it, others couldn't, and so we'd be affected by the impact of disease in other places because of global supply chains and the like. And so objectively, there's a powerful case for countries to work together. But as we've seen, there are also powerful forces that are pushing us in different directions. And certainly we haven't seen a huge uptake in terms of an all hands on deck focus on collaboration. As we've seen, the fight over the WHO, I think, is a classic case of this. Rather than rallying to the one organization which might do it and which clearly is flawed. And as Alexandra will tell you, we study this in my graduate seminar in the IR program. When we talk about the problems of international cooperation, we focus very much and did an exercise on the problems and inefficiencies and dysfunctions of the WHO. But this ought to be a mend it, don't end it moment for the WHO and for other international organizations. And yet it's not clear that that's the direction that we're going to go. So I would hope that there'll be time enough for fingers to be pointed and postmortems to be done on who did what wrong. But right now we need to focus not only on how can we work together to help our two countries deal with this, but also of the consequences as this pandemic spreads around the world.
I think we've gotten to the time where we might be nearing our last question, depending on the answer. We have a question from Patricia, who's had her hand raised for quite some time.
I think, is that on now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Well, my question relates to the foreign policy decision-making structure in China, and what I'm wondering wondering is how influential are various elements of the Chinese bureaucracy in terms of getting their wishes and their desires and their interests forward, particularly given an individual lead, I guess I'll use the term populist leader, but that's maybe not quite right. And what do we know about these other groups, or these groups, and then how does this all factor in to Chinese making?
Well, it's a great question, and you know, as George K. Pointed out, we don't have a lot of transparency about exactly how the Chinese system works, and it is certainly the case that the nature of the size and magnitude of the Chinese polity is that there's a lot of spread power, notwithstanding the formal authority that exists at the top with the Politburo Standing Committee. But I think the one thing should be very clear, which is there are a lot of contending forces within China. There are the state-owned enterprises, there's the PLA, there are the private entrepreneurs, there are a lot of factions and groups in society. But at the end, only one matters, and that is the Communist Party and the leadership of the Communist Party. So when the leadership seizes a question, there's a lot of pulling and hauling, but the leadership within the party ultimately will decide these things. Now, at earlier times, and certainly in the time of Hu Jintao and the previous leadership of China, there were divisions within the Politburo Standing Committee, and there wasn't sort of a single voice that dominated the decision making. I think we're pretty clear today that that is not the case today, that it's not just a first among equals in the Standing Committee. President Xi is in charge, and that when he decides to take charge, those are where the decisions are coming from. And what we've seen here is at the beginning, it was not entirely clear whether President Xi was prepared to take ownership of this and to have both the responsibility with all the risks and benefits of being associated with the management of the crisis. But that after the first weeks, he seemed to have reached the decision that for better or worse, he was going to get blamed if the response failed and potentially praised if it succeeded, and therefore he's going to take ownership. And we see him now personally involved, going to Hubei, traveling around, and allowing himself to be personally identified. So at the end of the day, that's where the authority is, and he's clearly asserting it. I think the evidence suggests that he and the leadership are feeling pretty good about where they stand right now. It's notable that they've just recently announced that they're going to hold the delayed meeting of the National People's Congress, and you can be sure that they would not have agreed to do that if they thought there was going to be a lot of dissent or challenges to President Xi's authority. And so I think after, as I said before, somewhat a rocky start and a little bit of indecision about whether the leadership was going to take ownership and whether President Xi personally was going to take ownership, that they ultimately came around to the decision that there was no other choice and have fully embraced that.
Thank you so much, Professor Steinberg. This has been a really fantastic session. I'd also like to thank Maxwell's outstanding information and computing technology team, Thomas Fazio, who you saw on our call, for supporting this talk. Thanks too to the staff of the Maxwell Dean's Office, to my colleagues Jessica Smith and Lane Norton, who you saw assist with today's session, and to our colleague, Associate Dean for External Relations, Scott Barrett, who was instrumental in organizing today's event but was unable to join us today. We will be continuing to host virtual events in the month of May, and we hope you'll join us for these sessions as well. Please stay tuned for an email communication coming soon, or if you found word of this through one of our alums or friends, feel free to contact me or keep an eye on our social media channels. If you have further questions or suggestions for future topics, specific Maxwell faculty members you'd like to hear from, or the timing or execution of these events, please email my colleague Scott Barrett. Jessica Smith has pasted his email address in the chat window. It's sabarr02@syr.edu. In the meantime, thank you so very much for attending. Thank you to Professor Steinberg. Be well and go Orange.